welcome to another video about Descartes' meditations. This is the final video within this series that's going to be covering Descartes' meditations directly. This time around, we are going to get to the question of mind and body. For Descartes, we can ask, why are they different things? And how can we know that they are not the same thing? After that, we'll reflect briefly by looking at a particular quotation about the question of how the mind and the body interact, at least according to how Descartes discusses it in the Meditations. So, just to put some terms on what we're seeing going on here with Descartes, we can call the view that Descartes is building up to in the Meditations substance dualism. So when we're talking about substance dualism, well, the title kind of gives it away. It's a theory about substances, and it's a theory that says substances are dual, right? So there's two substances, is basically the official view. So remember one of Descartes' claims about the Meditations in the subtitle of the work. That is, when you get a book and sometimes there's one title and then there's a smaller title underneath. That's what we're talking about when we talk about subtitles. And the complete title for Descartes' Meditations is Meditations on First Philosophy, and then here's the subtitle, in which the existence of God and the distinction between the soul and body is demonstrated. We talked about this in one of our earlier videos. We'll remember that demonstrate in the context of early modern philosophy basically means the strongest and most certain kind of proof, right? And when we're talking about a proof, we're saying we're proving that the soul and body are separate things. They are distinct, right? So when we say that body and soul are distinct, Descartes is telling us that they are two different kinds of things. And we can also think about the idea that they have independent existence, right? So whereas some things have dependent existence, that is, like greenness, according to Descartes, is dependent upon material substance. So there is no greenness without green things, right? Now, so we would say that greenness is dependent on other things, but ultimately soul and body are not dependent existences. They are what you might think of as kind of self-sufficient existences, right? So when we talk about something having independent existence, this is important because having independent existence is another way of saying that this thing is a substance. More specifically, we can talk about body and soul as finite substances. Now, here's the other thing that we'll notice. Descartes is going to say there's two kinds of things that ultimately exist in the world as we know it. There's bodies, material things. And Descartes is going to say there's something in common between all the bodies. Or if you don't want to confuse body with an animal body or a corpse, because Descartes means more than that. He's going to also say this die that's been sitting on my desk is also a material body, right? So we're using body in that broad sense. If it helps you, you can think about it as material things or corporeal substance. Those are some of the other words that we might see in this context. Descartes is going to say that bodies have certain necessary qualities, right? Other philosophers will eventually call these fundamental attributes. But we could say that the fundamental attribute, that is, the attribute that is shared by all bodies, is extension, right? So that is to be a thing that takes up space in the 3D realm. So it's things with height and width and depth, like this little cubical die, right? So we would say that this thing is a body because it has this quality of extension, where extension is just taking up space. Okay. The other kind of finite substance is souls. Oh gosh, what a typo there. I'm going to fix that. So a soul is a being with the necessary quality of thinking, right? So we can say that a soul, what it is to be a soul, is to be the kind of thing that is necessarily thinking, right? Now there's different ways of thinking, so you can be imagining or denying or doubting or doing algebra, right? But the idea is that what do all the souls share in common? Well, what all the souls share in common is that they are all engaging in thought. So in this way, Descartes is going to say, like, everything that exists in the material world is fundamentally going to be an extended thing or a thinking thing. And that's what's going to make Descartes a substance dualist, right? So that's the two kinds of beings that there are in the world. Now, we already saw one argument for substance dualism in Meditation 2, and there Descartes said, well, we can be sure that the mind exists. We can't be so sure that any extended substances exist. He doesn't actually prove that extended substances exist until Meditation 6, which I cover in the companion video to this one, the other Meditation 6 video. But in that Meditation 2 argument, he says, at this point, we're not sure that the material world exists at all. And if we're not sure that the material world exists, but we are sure that we exist, Descartes thinks that we can use that to prove that so we couldn't be a thing that doesn't exist. You know, how could there be a thing that we're sure of the existence of it and unsure of the existence of it at the same time? Well, we get a somewhat similar argument here in Meditation 6. And I'm going to call this first argument, we could call it like the redux argument of sum res cogitans. But here I'm just going to say that mind and body can be understood without one another. So here's Descartes' first thought. He's going to say, my ability clearly and distinctly to understand one thing without another suffices to make me certain that the one thing is different from the other, since they can be separated from each other, at least by God. Remember, when we think clearly and distinctly, we're going to be thinking about a thing's essences and necessary conclusions that follow from the essence of that thing. So, for instance, if you realize that you can clearly and distinctly understand what it is to be a cat, and understand that cats can have their existence without dogs, right? You could say, once you understand that difference, you would say that there is no way in which we would have to claim that dogs are the same things as cats, right? Because they could be separated from each other, at least by God. Now, notice that there are other things that are one and the same thing, and could not be separated from each other by God. So let's see. We could say that the 44th president of the United States, you would have to think about what it is to be that individual, and we would have to figure out, well, who are the different presidents of the United States? And we would then realize that the 44th presidency was Obama's presidency. Now, could you clearly and distinctly understand the 44th US president without being Obama? Now, it seems like Descartes could say, actually, maybe in one sense you could. You could imagine McCain winning, or Hillary Clinton beating Obama in the primary, and they become the 44th president. Now, in that sense, we can clearly and distinctly perceive Obama to be distinct from the 44th president in the sense that he didn't have to be. But in another sense, we could say that 44th president and Obama are one and the same thing, given the way that history turned out and given what we know about how history turned out. And if we say, one thing that we know to understand the nature of Obama is to understand that he was the president from 2009 to 2017, right? And in that sense, we would say, look, 44th president and Obama couldn't be separated from each other, not in the way we think about them. In a certain sense, now that Obama was the president from 2009 to 2017, not even God could pull those two things apart. But we can notice the broader importance of this thought, which is just that if two things are different, if two things are not one and the same thing, right? If this watch is not the same thing as this die, which they are not, then we can clearly understand this thing without any reference to the other thing, or vice versa, and they can be separated from each other and thought of clearly as distinct objects. Now, here's Descartes' next claim, and this is the big kicker, this is the important part. He's going to say, you can understand your mind without your body. So, for instance, you could believe that after you die, you could clearly understand your body staying in this earth and decomposing or being cremated, whereas you could imagine your mind living on. Maybe you could imagine your mind living on in heaven. Maybe some of you also believe that you could upload your brain onto a computer chip. And by uploading your brain onto a computer chip, you would say, look, your body dies, but your mind would continue to exist. And from this, we say, okay, so if you can understand one thing without the other, I can understand my mind without my body. We should also notice that most of us believe that we can understand our bodies without our minds. So for instance, your body could someday become a corpse, but your mind would no longer be in that body at that point. So it seems like at least we have some evidence that bodies and minds can be thought of and understood separately from one another. And maybe not just in a superficial sense, but Descartes is going to say, look, with my mind and my body, I'm not just imagining them separate, but I'm clearly and distinctly imagining them separate. So maybe we could say, I could even imagine my body exactly in the way that it is. So with my heart pumping and, with my lungs respirating, and all of that good stuff, my life functions, we could imagine all of that bodily stuff is going on, but we could also imagine the mind engaging in no activity. Now, some of y'all find this weird, but even a contemporary philosopher, David Chalmers, has argued, for instance, that we could at least imagine somebody who has all the same bodily functions. If you brain scan them, their brain scans would look like everybody else's. But on this person, they have no conscious experience, right? There's nothing it's like to be them. So there's no thinking or feeling or cogitating. They are just responding mechanistically to the universe along with certain bodily functions. David Chalmers calls these people with functioning bodies and understandable behaviors, even though conceptually we're imagining them to have no experience or thought inside of them. He calls these hypothetical people philosophical zombies. Right. Now, part of what Chalmers is doing with that argument about philosophical zombies is to carry through an idea in Descartes' argument, that we can clearly and distinctly separate the functioning of the body from what it is to be thinking, right? And this is what Descartes is going to do. From the fact that I know I exist, and that at the same time I judge that obviously nothing else belongs to my nature or essence except that I am a thinking thing, he says, my essence consists entirely in my being a thinking thing. So his essence does not consist in being a physical body in space. Remember, the essence of being a physical body is not thinking. The essence of a physical body is being extended. Now, we might ask some difficult questions. We might, for instance, ask, why say that your essence is thinking rather than saying, like, it's possible that your essence is thinking? Just because all living beings are having thoughts, it doesn't mean that they are constituted by thoughts, right? Just like every living human being has a height, it's not as if they are constituted by their height. There might be some philosophical troubles here. And, just like it's been objected against Chalmers and his zombie argument, it might be argued by the person who believes that you are your body, and it's your body that's doing the thinking. It might be suggested that we actually can't clearly and distinctly perceive thought as separate from a body. That is, every time you're thinking about thinking, you're actually thinking about a bodily function, a very specific, fancy brain activity. But it does seem that for Descartes, he's going to say, look, if I am thinking about the mind as separate and completely bringable into existence by God without bringing a body into existence, then thought is one kind of thing and a body is another kind of thing. And because God is no deceiver, when we think about minds as being separate from bodies, Descartes is going to think that's going to give us a reason to think that these things have utterly different essences. What's interesting, Descartes in Meditation 6 gives us yet another and a new, and perhaps, I think that to some people, the most compelling argument that he comes up with for substance dualism. And it's going to be what I'm going to call the divisibility argument. Now, here's a starting thought. If you want to find that two things are not one and the same thing, then what you can do is find a feature of one thing and then find a feature of the other thing and show that these features are incompatible with one another and show that, well, thing A has the feature, thing B doesn't and couldn't have the feature, and that also means that thing A and thing B cannot be the same thing, right? And because Descartes is going to be arguing against substance monism, we can say, look, thing A and thing B have a feature not in common, but in disagreement, right? And once we find that feature, we can say, these must not be the same thing, but distinct. Let me give you a fast example of that argument. We might say, for instance, that the 44th president of the United States was born in Hawaii. So that's going to be our first claim. And then we're going to say, Joe Biden was not born in Hawaii, right? Joe Biden was born in, I think, Scranton, Pennsylvania. So now we have two claims, right? The 44th president was born in Hawaii. Biden was born in Pennsylvania. Maybe we can sort of be clear that a second assumption could say, if you were born in Pennsylvania, then you weren't born in Hawaii, and if you were born in Hawaii, then you weren't born in Pennsylvania. I think that we can grant that assumption for this case. Now, once we grant that there's like this property that a thing cannot both have and not have, these properties are incompatible, we could then say, look, President 44 was born in Hawaii. Biden was not born in Hawaii, so Biden is not the 44th president, right? Biden is in fact the 46th president. Now, that seems like impeccable reasoning. So the thought that we're going to find here is that if we can find a quality that is had by one thing and not by another thing, then these two things would have to be distinct from one another, right? So, as you might have seen in this hint, it's divisibility that's doing the work here. So on page 125, Descartes said, there's a great difference between a mind and a body, in that a body, by its very nature, is always divisible, and on the other hand, a mind is utterly indivisible. So, from that, we can build an argument. Premise one, this is just going to be what it is to be body, right? And for Descartes, he's going to say a body, that's another way of saying material things, but these things are necessarily constituted by extension. And here's going to be our second point. Extension is always divisible. Think about it this way. I have a die in my hand. It is about 1.5 inches, right? Now, if I took this die and I cut it in half, then we'd take that 1.5 inches down to 3/4 of an inch, right? Now, if we took 3/4 of an inch, we could cut that in half, right? We could cut that in half to 3/8 of an inch. And if you take 3/8 of an inch, you could cut that down again and get 3/16 of an inch. And then you could cut that 3/16 of an inch down to 3/32, and then 30 to 64ths to 1/28. And I think you can see where I'm going here. For any quantitative amount of space, you could always just keep on doubling the number of that divisor, right? So, at the end we could get, 3/2 to the 500, right? This tiny, tiny, tiny amount of space, which we would say is sort of a representation of the idea that extended things, you could always cut them in half. This actually ties back to Descartes' physics. Descartes was, rather than an atomist, a corpuscularian. Corpuscularianism is kind of like the atomic theory of matter that we hold today, except corpuscles didn't have like little sub-constituent parts to them, like electrons and neutrons. Instead, it was just kind of stuff. And it was like a packet of stuff. Each material thing is like a packet of stuff arranged in certain ways. But it's also that stuff could always be split into a smaller packet. And when we think about space conceptually, we realize that for every fraction, we could always be rising the number on that divisor and making a smaller space. Here's going to be Descartes' second point. He's going to say mind, right, which is not an extended thing. Rather, Descartes is going to say mind is thinking, right? And we might say, for instance, that you cannot take thoughts and cut them in half, like I could take this physical die and cut it in half, right? With a mind, there's a thought, and that thought is a thing which is not in space in the first place. Like a thought has no weight. A thought has no depth or width or height, right? So Descartes is going to be arguing here on page 125 that minds are not divisible in the way that bodies are. Right, so you cannot cut a thought in half. Here's a second thought. We can actually borrow a thought from a philosopher who comes after Descartes. This is another way of saying that two things with different and incompatible features must be non-identical, right? So Leibniz famously argues that two things that have all the same properties are actually one and the same thing. If two things were exactly alike in every single property, then we would say that they're indiscernible, and if they're indiscernible, then they're identical. Now we can state that contrapositively as well. So not only are indiscernible things identical, but we can also say non-identical things must be discernible in some ways. Right? So if you've got two discernible things, they can't be one and the same thing. Well, we've just discerned extension from mind, right? The very fact that minds are not in space is the reason why we can't cut them in half. And so we're going to argue that the mind is not a material thing. So in this argument, we say, look, minds are just not the kinds of things that can be divided like physical objects. Therefore, they are not the same kind of thing as physical objects. Now, some people will try to say, like, look, I can actually find some ways of dividing thoughts or dividing the mind. So, for instance, they will say, look, if you are having an experience of the outdoors around you, so I have a tree out the window on my right side, which looks like a maple, and further out on my left side, I can see what looks to be an oak. Now, in that case, we might say, well, isn't there a right side and a left side of your visual field? Aren't those divisible? And we might also say, like, what if we accepted Freud's theory, that the mind has an id, ego, and superego? And we would say, look, haven't I just shown you divisions of the human mind? Descartes would have some answering to do there. For one thing, just because the mind is representing physical space and physical space can be divided, it doesn't mean that the thought itself can be divided. So either I'm having the thought or I'm not, and it's not the kind of thing that we can chop in half. For Freud's theory, we might say, look, that's a theory about a number of different thoughts, and we're not saying that different thoughts can't be held separately from one another, but rather each individual thought is not the kind of thing that can be divided in the same way that physical space can. Last thing that we might notice is that Descartes could then come out with a bunch of examples of thoughts that are not clearly divisible by two. So, when I divide something like a die in half, I can represent mathematically and in a chart, like here's the left half and here's the right half, like on this particular die, on the half that's on my left right now, there's the 1. On the half that's on my right, there's the 6. And if I were to chop it in half vertically, I would have the 6 in my left hand, or the 1 in my left hand and the 6 in my right hand. But you have a lot of thoughts, a lot of beliefs, especially these functions of the pure understanding, which aren't sensory experiences, that don't have a left half and a right half. Think about your belief that the Pythagorean theorem is true. This thought that for every right triangle, the two shorter sides, A and B, when squared and added, will be equal to the square of the longest side, the hypotenuse. Now, that's a thought. Is it the kind of thing that you can cut in half? Descartes is going to say no, because it's not the kind of thing that's made up of physical matter extended in space. And because these two things have different and incompatible properties, one being divisible, one being not divisible, the mind cannot be the same kind of thing as a material thing. So we've got two arguments here for substance dualism. One, that we can clearly and distinctly perceive mind and body as separate. Second argument that says minds are divisible. No, minds are indivisible. Extension is always divisible. Therefore, a thing can't be both divisible and not divisible, so the mind isn't a divisible body. Now, here's a last question, and this will actually throw us into some further discussions. How do the mind and body interact? Descartes says that nature teaches that I am present to my body not merely in the way that a sailor is present in a ship, but that I am most tightly joined and, so to speak, commingled with it. So much so that I and the body constitute one single thing. When the body is in need of food or drink, I should understand this explicitly, instead of having confused sensations of hunger and thirst. For certainly these sensations of hunger and thirst, hunger, pain, and so on, are nothing but certain confused modes of thinking arising from the union, and as it were, the commingling of the mind with the body. So when he says that the mind and the body, I and my body, constitute one single thing, what he's really talking about here is a certain kind of hybrid object. The hybrid object of your mind and body. He even seems to say in some contexts, that's what we should call a human being. Even though what's really you is just part of the human being, the soul. But he's also going to be suggesting here that it's a very close, intimate relationship between your mind and your body, right? So for instance, he says, what happens when you are a sailor on a ship and the ship gets damaged? Well, you are going to become indirectly aware of that ship's damage, right? Maybe the ship gets scraped, it knocks into an iceberg, and at first you don't realize it. And then you look over and see that the hull is broken. So you're indirectly experiencing the damage to the ship. But when you are a soul in a body, we would say that the body is going to have certain kinds of experiences, right? Of, say, pain and so on and so forth. Now, this is discussed in the other video a little bit, that we have certain kinds of confused sensations that emerge because, for instance, we need our soul and body to keep cooperating with one another. And, for instance, we need to keep the body healthy, right? And part of how God set things up is that he gives our minds certain sensations that say, you're going to have a feeling in your throat, and that's going to make you feel thirsty, and that's going to cause you to drink some water. Right? And so Descartes is going to say these are certain kinds of confused modes of thinking, right? Why is that? Well, it's not like your pain or your thirst is going to represent reality as it actually is, but it's more like it's giving you signals, right? And certain kinds of qualitative experiences are going to help us manage that relationship between mind and body. But we're not done with this question of mind and body. So, for instance, very soon we're going to see objections from Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, but we will also see discussion about the relationship between mind and body from philosophers like Spinoza. The main thing to notice here is that Descartes, on the one hand, is going to say that mind and body are not the same thing, but then he's going to also have to give us complicated explanations of how these two different kinds of things are interacting with one another and supporting one another through some sort of process of symbiosis. So I'll leave that for you to reflect on. But as always, thanks for listening. And if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to be in touch. All right, take care.